The ink on the surrender terms was barely dry when the air filled with screams. At Fort William Henry, British and colonial troops believed they'd secured safe passage. They were catastrophically wrong. Within hours, Allied Native American warriors, unconstrained by European rules of war, descended upon the vulnerable soldiers and even the sick in the hospital. The promised honorable retreat morphed into a desperate, blood-soaked flight for survival. Fort William Henry, situated at the southern tip of Lake George, served as a critical frontier outpost in the simmering conflict between British colonial interests and New France, a theater of the larger French and Indian War. This region marked a volatile borderland, the control of which would significantly influence European colonial ambitions on the North American continent. The Hudson River corridor, linked with Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, formed the most direct navigable route between France's Canadian holdings and Britain's southern colonies. Command of these waterways was tantamount to control over troop movement and, by extension, continental dominance. New France laid claim to a vast arc of territory stretching from the Atlantic coast along the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and southwards down the Mississippi River Valley to New Orleans. However, much of this territory was sparsely populated. Isolated French trading posts, primarily facilitating the fur trade with various Native American groups, were the main French presence. The estimated population of New France hovered around 75,000. In stark contrast, over 1 million settlers inhabited the 13 British colonies arrayed along the eastern seaboard. This demographic imbalance compelled the French to cultivate strong alliances with Native American tribes when hostilities with the more populous British erupted. Most indigenous populations tended to favor the French. French colonial policy was generally less aggressive in terms of land acquisition. They typically established trading posts and engaged in commerce rather than clearing vast tracts of forest for agriculture, a practice that displaced native communities. The French actively sought to incorporate Native Americans as allies, integrating them into their military and economic spheres. The early 1750s were characterized by an uneasy peace between the two European powers. This fragile calm shattered in 1754. Disputes over land in the Ohio River Valley ignited several minor skirmishes. When British parties advanced to establish a trading post at the forks of the Ohio River, the French perceived this as an encroachment and dispatched a small military force to eject them. Hostilities escalated rapidly, resulting in significant British losses and marking the formal commencement of the French and Indian War. The following year, 1755, saw a multi-pronged British offensive targeting several French forts. Major General William Johnson, an agent for the Iroquois Confederacy, received orders to advance on Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point, a strategically vital position on the New York frontier. During the summer of 1755, Johnson marched north from Albany with a force of 1,500 colonial militia and Mohawk allies. He halted approximately 50 miles north at the Great Carrying Place, the portage connecting the Hudson River to the northern lakes. There, construction began on Fort Edward. Captain Eyre, who sighted the fort, noted its potential strategic value, stating it would be very serviceable in case of a retreat. On the 28th of August, Johnson reached the southern terminus of what the French called Lac du Saint-Sacrement. He promptly renamed it Lake George, not only in honor to His Majesty but to ascertain his undoubted dominion here. Johnson ordered his men to clear the land and establish a common type of encampment. Native American scouts detected Johnson's force and relayed this intelligence to the French garrison at Fort St. Frederick. French forces, under the command of Baron Dieskau, prepared a countermove, advancing south along Johnson's newly cut road toward Lake George. Johnson dispatched a detachment of approximately 1,000 men, composed of Massachusetts provincials and over 200 Mohawk warriors, to intercept the approaching French. They marched between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. About an hour and a half later, the heavy report of musketry echoed through the woods. The relief column had marched directly into an ambush. The French had formed a hook, intending to envelop the entire British formation. Fortuitously for the British, Canadian militia and their native allies positioned on the flanks opened fire prematurely. This uncoordinated volley largely negated the effectiveness of the French regulars in the planned ambush. A contingent of British Colonials and Mohawks executed a covering fire action, protecting the retreating and wounded during a fighting withdrawal. This engagement became known as the Bloody Morning Scout. As the sounds of sustained musket fire drew nearer to Johnson's main camp at Lake George, his men scrambled to prepare for an attack. Johnson ordered boats to be beached and wagons overturned, improvising a temporary breastwork around the encampment. When the French column appeared, Dieskau ordered his regulars to make a frontal assault along the lakeside road. He anticipated this would draw the bulk of the defenders' fire, allowing his Canadian and Native American forces to execute a flanking maneuver against the camp. As the French regulars advanced, artillery and musket fire erupted from the British camp. The French regulars stood their ground for some time with great resolution and good conduct, but the hot and constant fire from the British artillery and muskets threw them into disarray. With the French regulars faltering, the Canadians and Native Americans engaged from the woodline, but proved unable to overrun the camp. Both Johnson and Dieskau sustained wounds during the engagement. Dieskau's were much more severe. Around 4 o'clock, Colonial troops and their Mohawk allies vaulted the breastworks, pursuing the enemy. They killed many and captured several prisoners, including Baron Dieskau, the overall commander of the French regular forces. Witnessing their commander fall, the Canadian and Native American contingents withdrew. By most contemporary accounts, the British Colonials secured a victory at the Battle of Lake George. They had held their camp and captured the enemy commander. It marked the first occasion a Colonial army had actually defeated a well-trained, well-disciplined European fighting force. Many of these young Colonial soldiers would later become prominent officers during the American Revolution. However, the victory came at a considerable cost. Both sides suffered several hundred casualties. Johnson's force was mauled and exhausted. Instead of pursuing the retreating French or advancing on Crown Point, they opted to consolidate their position at Lake George. A site was selected for the construction of a permanent fort. Approximately 400 men were detailed for this task, with the expectation that the fort would make great progress and be put in a respectable posture before the army departed for the season. Throughout the autumn of 1755, the forests echoed with the sounds of axes from both British and French forces. As work progressed on Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George, the French were simultaneously engaged in constructing Fort Carillon, later known as Ticonderoga, at the lake's northern head. By mid-November 1755, the British flag was raised over Fort William Henry. The fort itself was an irregular square in design, with its western wall being longer than the other 3 sides. Each side measured close to 300 feet, anchored by corner bastions that allowed for defensive fire across multiple approaches. The east, west, and south walls were further protected by a dry moat. The terrain to the north of the fort sloped downwards towards the lake. To the east of the fortification lay a marshy area, which served as an additional natural obstacle to any attacking force. Internally, Fort William Henry housed 2-story barracks, a powder magazine, and a hospital. The barracks could accommodate between 400 and 500 men. Additional troops were quartered in an entrenched camp situated to the west of the main fort. The year 1756 saw a formal declaration of war between Great Britain and France. The French and Indian War was now officially subsumed into a larger global conflict, the 7 Years' War. Hostilities spread across Europe, extending to theaters in India, Africa, and the Americas. Both nations committed regular army troops to fight in North America. This year also brought significant changes in command. Following the wounding and capture of Baron Dieskau at Lake George, the Marquis de Montcalm was appointed as the new field commander for French forces. On the British side, John Campbell, the 4th Earl of Loudon, was named Commander-in-Chief of Forces in North America. However, Lord Loudon did not arrive in the colonies until July. In the interim, Major General Daniel Webb was tasked with the defense of the New York frontier. Webb proceeded with caution, moving slowly up the Mohawk River to resupply and reinforce the western outposts. In contrast, General Montcalm acted with celerity. In August 1756, his forces launched an attack on Oswego, a cluster of British forts located on Lake Ontario. The French assault commenced on the 11th of August. The British garrison at Oswego held out for 3 days, but the French force proved too strong. The British commander was struck by a cannonball and literally had his head shot off. This event had a profound impact on the morale of the British garrison, leading to their almost immediate surrender. Montcalm achieved a decisive victory. His troops captured a significant quantity of artillery, while his Native American allies entered the fort and began to plunder it. The fall of Oswego was a strategic disaster for the British. One of the most significant repercussions for the French was the dissemination of news among the Native American tribes that the French were a formidable power capable of defeating the British. This greatly enhanced French prestige among the indigenous populations. News of Oswego's capture created a sensation in the Western Territories. A large number of Native Americans appeared, full of enthusiasm, expressing their desire to join the French in the following season, to drive back the English at Lake George. The intelligence regarding the successful French assault on Oswego put the garrisons at both ends of Lake George on high alert. Montcalm hastened back to the New York frontier. He ordered the establishment of a new entrenched camp on the Lachute River to secure the portage and supply line between Lake Champlain and Lake George. This position could serve both to slow any potential British advance northward and act as a staging area for future French incursions into the New York colony. At Fort William Henry, the British focused their efforts on gathering intelligence concerning French dispositions to the north. This proved to be a difficult undertaking. New France's Native American allies acted as both scouts for the French and as a protective screen, interdicting British ranger companies dispatched into the forests for reconnaissance. By year's end, major operations ceased. Montcalm returned to Montreal and concentrated on securing the Lake Champlain region. He considered the campaign of 1756 to have been the most brilliant yet seen in North America. Late in the winter of 1757, the governor of Canada, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, formulated a plan for an attack on Fort William Henry. His brother, François-Pierre de Rigaud, led a force of nearly 1,600 French regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors south over the frozen surface of Lake Champlain. They encountered quite varied weather conditions. The ice on Lake Champlain softened due to unseasonably warm weather, and they faced rain, snow, and days where 5 to 6 inches of water covered the ice, soaking their supplies. The French force reached the southern end of Lake Champlain on the 5th of March, 1757. On the 15th of March, they departed Fort Carillon and began their advance across the frozen Lake George. They were very uncertain about the condition of the ice on Lake George, given their experiences on Lake Champlain. Each of the 3 French attack columns had men preceding them with lanterns and small axes, testing the thickness of the ice. In the early morning hours of the 19th of March, sentries at Fort William Henry were alerted by activity on the ice. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the sound of axes was heard approximately 3 miles from the fort, which gave the alarm. The French forces initiated their attack but were held at bay by the British defenders. The order within the fort was to stand their ground. At dawn, the French withdrew, intending to resume their assault under the cover of darkness. That night, they commenced burning the vessels, bateaux, and outbuildings surrounding the fort. The fires burned violently, causing concern on one side of the fort that the opposite works were also ablaze. However, fortunately, no damage was sustained due to precautions taken. The engagement continued in this manner for several days, concluding on the night of the 22nd of March. The French destroyed 300 enemy bateaux, 4 sloops, and 2 storehouses. The winter garrison, composed of the 44th Regiment of Foot, had behaved bravely and done very good service. Major William Eyre reported only 7 men wounded and none killed, but they had lost nearly all their watercraft and naval stores. The winter garrison eagerly awaited relief. By the 3rd of April, 5th Regiment of Foot, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Monro, arrived to replace them. Throughout the spring and summer, Monro and his men settled into their new posting. Life at the fort was described as probably pretty rough. Diary entries from soldiers spoke of how horrible things were at Fort William Henry. Contemporary understanding of sanitation and disease prevention was not really known at the time, resulting in a lot of sickness. The French remained determined to secure the New York frontier. Montcalm spent the late spring and early summer of 1757 assembling his forces and recruiting Native American allies. News of his success at Oswego had traveled far and greatly aided his efforts. Canoes carrying Native Americans arrived daily. The numbers coming from the far west now exceed 1,000. Some warriors hailed from tribes so distant that no Canadian interpreter could understand their language. Throughout the first half of July, French forces converged on Carillon. In June and July, General Webb at Fort Edward seemed almost oblivious to the mounting French threat. He dispatched Colonial troops and stores to Fort William Henry, but did so without a discernible sense of urgency. This was despite continuous reports from scouts detailing enemy encounters. Mohawk scouts captured a French prisoner near Crown Point, who confirmed that Montcalm was advancing with 6 battalions, 300 bateaux, and all the artillery captured from the Ohio Valley and Oswego. At Fort William Henry, Lieutenant Colonel Monro was anxious to obtain further intelligence regarding French movements. On the 22nd of July, he ordered Colonel John Parker of the New Jersey Regiment, along with approximately 50 men from the New York Regiment, to conduct a reconnaissance in force down Lake George. By the end of the day, a contingent of 300 men in over 20 whaleboats had navigated past the islands in the Narrows and made camp for the night. Their presence on the lake did not go unobserved. Word of the British flotilla reached Carillon, and a force was dispatched to intercept them. The following morning, as the British whaleboats approached Sabbath Day Point, French allied Native American warriors launched their canoes onto the lake. By the time the British colonials recognized the imminent attack, it was too late. Accounts suggest the enemy, upon sighting Parker's force, were so intimidated they dropped their arms. What should have been a contested engagement rapidly devolved into a rout. Immediately, the British were observed pulling for the shore in the greatest hurry, while some men leaped into the water, attempting to swim to safety. Native warriors pursued them into the water, spearing them like fish. The British were reportedly terrified by the gunfire, the spectacle of the attack, the war cries, and the agility of these monsters, and many surrendered with barely a shot fired in their defense. Only 4 whaleboats managed to escape the onslaught. The Native Americans captured nearly 200 prisoners. The remainder were either drowned or killed. This engagement became known as the Sabbath Day Point Massacre. The prisoners taken back to Carillon provided valuable intelligence concerning the strength and disposition of forces at Fort William Henry. However, these captives also created a complex situation for Montcalm. The Native Americans had learned from the Oswego campaign that the French would ransom prisoners. Following their victory on the 22nd of July, they possessed a large number of captives and wished to transport them to Canada to sell to the French authorities in Montreal. Many expressed a desire to return to Montreal, arguing it would be tempting God to expose themselves to the risks of further warfare after such a significant success. European commanders did not fully comprehend the Native American way of war. Their approach often involved controlling an engagement from start to finish, and then withdrawing quickly with any acquired plunder or captives. Once their immediate objectives were met, they had little interest in protracted sieges or adhering to European military timetables that might involve weeks of building up logistical support. Montcalm managed to persuade the native warriors to remain. He issued them receipts for the prisoners and had the British captives sent to Montreal. On the 26th of July, Montcalm convened a council at the Falls with all the chiefs of the various allied tribes. He shared his plan of attack and solicited their approval and participation. During this council, a large tree fell, an event Montcalm skillfully interpreted as an omen foretelling the fall of Fort George, Fort William Henry. Chief Minnick, on behalf of the far western Native Americans, accepted this interpretation. The disastrous attack at Sabbath Day Point galvanized the British into action. General Webb, accompanied by his chief engineer and other officers, departed Fort Edward to inspect the defenses of Fort William Henry. A council of war made several decisions regarding defensive improvements and marked out a location on the ground for a new entrenched camp. The decision was made to site this new camp on the same ground William Johnson had defended in 1755 to the southeast of the fort. This location was on higher ground. If the French were to occupy it, they could easily bring artillery fire to bear down upon the fort itself. Several other recommendations were made, including covering the powder magazine with sandbags, raising the east bastion by 1 log in height, and establishing a system of signals between Fort William Henry and Fort Edward. The soldiers at the fort were put to work, constructing a temporary log breastwork around the new camp. The extent to which these other preparatory works were completed remains unclear. General Webb returned to Fort Edward on the 30th of July. Upon his arrival, he dispatched letters to Albany requesting reinforcements. It appeared that prior to his visit to Fort William Henry, Webb had been entirely unconcerned by the French threat. Now, he was desperately appealing for more troops to bolster the defenses. Montcalm had assembled an army of 8,000 men, a formidable force that included 1,800 Native American warriors drawn from over 30 different tribes. They were supported by an artillery train of more than 40 cannons. Soldiers worked day and night to transport the French army from Carillon to the shores of Lake George. The logistical effort was immense, moving significant artillery pieces, 250 bateaux, and 6 weeks' provisions for 10,000 men, all without the aid of horses or oxen, relying solely on human strength, was a monumental undertaking. In the final days of July, nearly 2,500 men under the command of the Chevalier de Lévis formed an advance guard. They marched overland through the forests, spearheaded by 500 Native Americans down the west bank of Lake George. 2 days later, on the 1st of August, the main body of the French army began its movement up the lake. The army embarked at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with Monsieur de Joannes's boat leading the flotilla of 250 vessels. They halted at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 leagues from Carillon, where the Native Americans who had preceded them in 150 canoes awaited. The spectacle was described as extraordinary, even for soldiers accustomed to European armies, to imagine the sight of 1,500 naked Indians in their canoes. Early the next morning, the French flotilla rendezvoused with the overland force. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the Marquis de Montcalm reached the Bay of Gueux, the designated meeting point for the infantry divisions. 3 fires burning on the shore served as the prearranged signal confirming Chevalier de Lévis's presence. The French had completed their initial advance up Lake George. Around noon, Chevalier de Lévis again led his force south through the forest to secure their next encampment. At Fort William Henry, the garrison continued their labor on the new entrenched camp. Meanwhile, General Webb dispatched troops from Fort Edward to reinforce the position on the lake. Around sunset, these regulars arrived at the camp where General Johnson had fought in 1755. Once all forces were consolidated within the camp and the fort, they numbered approximately 2,200 men fit for duty. That evening, a reconnaissance party of 14 men in 2 whaleboats was sent to patrol the lake. Around 10 o'clock at night, 2 enemy barges approached the shore where the Native American canoes were concentrated. The native warriors within earshot shouted their usual cry and gave chase to the British boats. About 10 o'clock, those in the fort heard a smart firing of small arms upon the lake, approximately 4 miles distant. This led them to suspect the enemy's approach. Throughout the night, the soldiers at Fort William Henry made the necessary dispositions to prepare for an attack. Sentries were posted, and vigilance was heightened. Native American scouts relayed this information regarding the British alertness to the French, whereupon orders for marching were doubled. The French army commenced its final approach on the morning of the 3rd of August. At first light, the defenders of Fort William Henry observed the enemy flotilla appearing from behind a point of land on the western side of the lake. The extended formation of boats, bateaux, and canoes nearly stretched across the body of water. Artillery pieces, mounted on platforms secured to bateaux, led the advance. As the flotilla passed the point of land that had momentarily obscured it from the fort's view, the French paid their compliments to the fort with a general discharge of their cannons. Activity within Fort William Henry intensified. British regulars and colonial militia hurriedly prepared for the impending assault. Livestock was secured, and a detachment of New England provincials was dispatched to burn huts and fences to the west of the fort, clearing fields of fire. It seemed from some contemporary accounts that the garrison had not expected to be besieged, though the basis for such confidence is difficult to ascertain. Further south at Fort Edward, the sound of cannon fire from Lake George was audible. General Webb immediately dispatched expresses to Albany, urgently requesting additional troops. His message conveyed that signals had indicated the enemy's approach at Fort William Henry, and he therefore desired that you will use all means to hasten the levies of the militia. Back at Lake George, the French vessels continued their advance, landing on the western shore a few miles from the fort. As the enemy began to disembark, Colonel Monro ordered 100 Massachusetts soldiers to move out onto the road leading towards Fort Edward. These colonial troops almost immediately encountered the 1,800 Native American warriors allied with the French. The Massachusetts detachment fell back to the entrenched camp, having suffered 18 killed and several wounded. While the French flotilla was making its approach, Chevalier de Lévis, with his overland force spearheaded by native warriors, had been marching through the wilderness. After covering miles through dense forest and mountainous terrain, his command now occupied positions in the woods to the south of Fort William Henry. Following the retreat of the Massachusetts men, referred to as Captain Sutenstall's party in some accounts, possibly a company commander within that detachment, the enemy nearly surrounded us and maintained a constant firing with small arms. The British garrison returned fire, employing grape shot from their 12-pounder cannons, which proved to good effect against the Native American skirmishers. While the native warriors engaged the fort and the entrenched camp, the remainder of Montcalm's army established their main encampment at the western edge of the lake. Early in the afternoon, the French displayed a flag of truce. They utilized a red flag, as the flag of New France was white, which would not have been clearly distinguishable as a parley flag by the British. Montcalm sent a letter to Colonel Monro demanding the surrender of the fort. In his communication, Montcalm explicitly invoked the savagery of the Indians as a means of persuasion. "I have this morning invested your place with a numerous army, a superior artillery, and all the savages from the higher countries, the cruelty of which a part of your garrison have lately too much experienced. I am obliged in humanity to desire you to surrender your fort." During this parley, Native American warriors encircled the fort in a display of force. One Abenaki, speaking broken French, shouted, "You won't surrender, eh? Then look out for yourselves, for if I catch you, you'll get no quarter." The presence of these French-allied native warriors instilled great fear in the minds of many within the British garrison, who were familiar with accounts of frontier raids over the preceding 70 or 80 years. Many younger soldiers, who had never before witnessed native warriors in their war paint, were likely terrified. The British command, however, remained resolute in their response to Montcalm. Colonel Monro replied that as long as there was one log upon another, or he had a man to fight, he should defend it. This spirited refusal was promptly announced by the roar of a general discharge from the enemy's artillery. Immediately after the parley concluded, the engagement resumed. The British continued to bombard the French positions, attempting to disrupt the construction of their siege works. The remainder of the day was characterized by a constant fire, directed at the British garrison from enemy muskets, and a constant fire from the fort's cannons and mortars in reply. As night fell, Colonel Monro penned a dispatch to General Webb at Fort Edward, requesting reinforcements. He also received a letter from Webb. Webb stated that the place had been so suddenly invested by the enemy that it was impossible to send any expresses. Webb apparently had 3 letters addressed to Monro that had not yet been dispatched. He mentioned that the Native Americans had been firing all day. Webb expressed that he had no doubt Monro would soon receive reinforcements, and that he was determined to support Monro as soon as possible with the whole army if necessary. While the British garrison awaited relief from Fort Edward, the French army labored throughout the night to establish their siege lines. The enemy was busy, the entire preceding night digging entrenchments and bringing up supplies. The British, lacking sufficient numbers for a sortie, could not prevent this, but they annoyed them as much as possible from the fort with a continuous cannonade from their artillery and mortars. With daylight on the 4th of August, the fighting continued briskly. The day was marked by constant skirmishes with native warriors in the surrounding woods and ongoing harassment of the enemy siege, works by artillery fire from the fort and the entrenched camp. The Native Americans effectively invested the entrenched camp, pinning down the British and colonial troops within. They even threatened the fort's water supply. The activity and courage of the native warriors led to an increase in prisoners taken. It became impossible for the British to move even a step outside their prepared positions without facing the risk of capture or death. While the native warriors kept the garrison engaged, French soldiers continued their labor on the siege trenches. The fort maintained a brisk fire upon them as they worked. An observer noted, "To see the alacrity with which they carried the materials to the trenches, you would have mistaken them for people invulnerable to the enemy's active and continual fire." The persistent British bombardment of the trenches did little to deter the French. The primary consequence for the British was the attrition of their own artillery. On the 4th of August, they experienced the misfortune of having a mortar burst. At Fort Edward, General Webb persisted in sending requests for reinforcements to Albany and the neighboring colonies. A Canadian prisoner had informed Webb that the French forces numbered 11,000 men. Based on this inflated intelligence, Webb felt he lacked sufficient troops to relieve Fort William Henry, or even to adequately defend the New York frontier itself should Montcalm advance further south after reducing the fort. General Webb also dispatched a letter responding to Colonel Monro's messages from the previous day. This crucial letter, however, would not reach Fort William Henry for several days. Webb's couriers were intercepted en route from Fort Edward. One party, described as Connectons, possibly referring to Connecticut men, encountered 3 individuals. One was captured, one killed, and the third escaped. The individual who returned brought back the prisoner and the coat of the deceased man. Within its lining, they discovered a letter dated the 4th at midnight. Hundreds of French soldiers toiled through the night of the 4th of August, constructing their siege lines. The first parallel and a communication trench leading to a planned second parallel were completed. On the morning of the 5th of August, the engagement continued. Native warriors maintained their harassing musket fire, and many advanced into the cleared ground surrounding Fort William Henry. The defenders returned fire and suffered further losses to their artillery. All day we kept a constant fire from the fort on the enemy's works, but had the misfortune to have 2 32-pounders and 1 18-pounder burst. The Native Americans plied us with their small arms as much as possible. As the siege wore on, the Native American allies of the French grew increasingly impatient. They felt that they alone had been actively engaged in combat up to this point. They were eager to see the French artillery commence its bombardment and for the French regulars to join the fight more directly. All the Indian nations began to be tired with the silence of our big guns. They did not want to continue to bear the brunt of the old war. Recognizing this growing unrest, Montcalm convened a council at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He shared with the Native American chiefs the contents of the intercepted letter from General Webb. He outlined his plan of attack and informed them that the artillery bombardment would commence the following morning. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 6th of August, the French left battery, consisting of 8 cannons, began to play. They fired 2 rounds, followed shortly thereafter by 7 more, very quick, one after another. This hot fire was maintained all day. The French gunners found their range quickly. The garrison of Fort William Henry endured a furious assault from the French artillery. "Stand clear! They have got our range very well. Several of their small shells fall in the parade. One shot carried away the sheave of our flagstaff, and down came the flag, which pleased the enemy very much. However, the flag was soon hoisted again. One of the soldiers engaged in this task was decapitated by a cannonball. With each successful impact from the French artillery, the Native American warriors shouted their approval. The yelling was so great that all the mountains echoed with the sound. Throughout the siege, it was never necessary to move far to ascertain the effect of the bombardment. The shouts of the Indians at any time carried the news to all parts of our camp. To the shock of some within the entrenched camp, they recognized the British Royal Arms insignia on some of the incoming cannonballs. These were very likely projectiles captured from the British at Oswego the previous year. As the French artillery battered the fort, native warriors again advanced against the entrenched camp. Colonel Monro dispatched a party of New England troops to meet them. They were quickly outnumbered and forced to withdraw. Artillery within the camp was then brought to bear to disperse the attackers. During this action, an unfortunate friendly fire incident occurred. As some of the provincial soldiers were returning to the camp, they were mistaken for the enemy and fired upon, resulting in several killed and wounded. Montcalm's forces were having great effect. Both the Native American skirmishers and the 1st French Battery were steadily weakening the fort and the camp. On the 6th of August, numerous soldiers in the camp were wounded. One sentinel had his thigh shot off with an 18-pounder while on duty. The cannonball passed through the corner of his tent, shredding it. Throughout the day, the fort itself sustained relatively little structural damage, but lost several more artillery pieces. Colonel Monro detailed these losses in a letter to General Webb. As a proof of the insufficiency of our artillery, we have had within these 24 hours 2 10-pounders. 1 12-pounder and 1 mortar burst. They were compelled to move 2 12-pounder cannons from the camp to the fort, a task they accomplished with great difficulty. In a separate communication, Monro once again expressed his urgent need for reinforcements and the desperate situation at Lake George. While the garrison at Fort William Henry awaited relief, reinforcements began to arrive at Fort Edward. General Webb, however, seemed timid or indecisive in his actions. By the 4th day of the siege, approximately 2,000 militia had reached Fort Edward, a force that could have moved north to attempt to break the siege. They might not have succeeded, and this was likely Webb's concern, that he would risk a situation where that force could be defeated, and if Montcalm then chose to advance south, Fort Edward would inevitably fall. Whatever his reasoning, Webb did not march to the relief of Fort William Henry. Those at Lake George were left to their own devices. On the 6th of August, the siege began to be very hot. The onset of night brought little respite to the beleaguered defenders of Fort William Henry. The bombardment continued. All the next night, there was approximately a 15-minute interval between each discharge of the French guns. While their artillery hammered the fort, French infantry continued to advance their siege works under the cover of darkness. On the morning of the 7th of August, the French bombardment commenced very briskly and continued with intensity until 10 o'clock, when another flag of truce appeared from the French lines. Montcalm dispatched his aide-de-camp to deliver the letter from General Webb that had been intercepted on the 5th of August. He believed this communication would demonstrate to Colonel Monro the futility of further resistance. In the letter, Webb confirmed receipt of Monro's 3 previous dispatches. He then stated, "He has ordered me to acquaint you. He does not think it prudent, as you know his strength at this place, to attempt a junction or to assist you, till reinforced by the militia of the colonies." Webb further added that he judged it proper to give you this intelligence, so that Monro might be able to make the best terms left in your power, in the event that relief was not timely due to delays in the arrival of the militia. One can only imagine Colonel Monro's reaction upon reading General Webb's assessment. However, the letter did not have the effect Montcalm had perhaps anticipated. It was considered surprising to see so small a body of men, with all hopes of success cut off, behave with so much resolution as the garrison did in the immediate aftermath. Throughout the day, the siege continued hotly. French artillery consistently found their marks. Shot and shell fell upon the bastions and into the parade ground. One shell landed in the entrenched camp, wounding Captain Orr Spears, the senior officer of the regulars stationed there. Compounding the dire situation, more of the British cannons burst. It appears these mounting artillery losses, coupled with the contents of Webb's letter, began to significantly erode morale within the garrison. On the 7th of August, enemy fire into the camp killed and wounded several more men. During the night, 2 regular soldiers deserted from the fort. A sense of dread had spread amongst the besieged, to the extent that some observers felt they no longer acted like soldiers, except in giving orders. Monro, however, demonstrated no tolerance for cowardice or desertion. On the 7th of August, he issued orders proclaiming that if any person proved cowardly or offered to Zemfir abandon the fort, he would be immediately hanged over the walls. He himself was determined to stand it to the last, or as long as 2 sticks would stand together. The situation at Fort William Henry was growing worse and worse. The French pushed their siege works forward almost indifferently to the musket and cannon fire from the fort. On the morning of the 8th of August, they advanced their trenches through a small swamp towards the fort's garden, continuing this labor throughout the day. The British and Colonial troops continued to fight as well as they could. They maintained their engagement with the Canadians and Native Americans, encircling the camp, and returned fire with their dwindling number of serviceable artillery pieces. We continued skirmishing all day as usual, and annoyed them as much as we possibly could. The garrison's position became increasingly desperate. French artillery had now accurately ranged both the fort and the entrenched camp. Meanwhile, the French diligently pressed their siege trenches ever closer. During the night of the 8th of August, the French completed this work and established breaching batteries in this new position behind the fort's garden. This critical work was well advanced during the night, even though the fire from the fort was described as never so brisk. As the French army pushed its trenches up behind the fort's garden, the British command undertook a frank assessment of their circumstances. That evening, an engineer was sent to inspect the state of the fortifications. He reported that, considering the condition of the artillery, ammunition, and other stores, the fort was no longer tenable. Furthermore, The soldiers had been without rest for 5 nights and were nearly stupefied with fatigue. In the early morning hours of the 9th of August, 1757, Lieutenant Colonel Monro convened a council of war with all the officers of the fort and the camp. The situation was grave. The French were very close. Having advanced their works to within approximately 100 yards of the fort, in addition to the inexorable advance of the French trenches, the British had suffered further critical losses to their artillery. Early on the morning of the 9th of August, they had the misfortune of another mortar bursting. They were left with only fit for use within the fort: 2 6-pounders, 1 9-pounder, 2 4-pounders, 1 7-inch mortar, and 1 7-inch howitzer, with very little ammunition or shells suitable for them. Monro's Council of War deliberated on the grim realities. The French advance, combined with the catastrophic state of their own artillery, doubtless made the decision clear to them. Based on the representations of several officers, they concluded that nothing further could be done for the defense of Fort William Henry. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the fort displayed a white flag and requested terms of surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Young was dispatched to the French camp to negotiate the Articles of Capitulation. The terms of surrender were drawn up as follows. The troops of the fort and the entrenched camp would march out with the honors of war, their colors flying. The soldiers would be permitted to retain their personal baggage and would be provided with a French escort to Fort Edward. The fort itself was to be handed over immediately. The entrenched camp would be surrendered after the departure of the British troops. All artillery, munitions, and military stores were to be delivered to the French forces. The soldiers garrisoned at Fort William Henry agreed not to serve again in the present war for a period of 18 months. All French, Canadian, and Native American prisoners held by the British were to be returned to Fort Carillon within 3 months. A British officer was to be delivered as a hostage until the return of the French escort. All sick and wounded were to remain under the care of the Marquis de Montcalm and would be returned when they recovered. Critically, the provisions guaranteeing the safety of the British troops were stipulated as being valid for that day and the morrow only. As a mark of respect for the garrison's brave defense, the British were permitted to march to Fort Edward with 1 symbolic cannon. Before signing the Articles of Capitulation, the Marquis de Montcalm assembled a council with the chiefs of all the allied Native American tribes. He informed them of the terms being granted to the besieged and the motivations that had led him to offer them. He sought their consent and their promise that their young men would not commit any disorder. The chiefs, reportedly, agreed to everything and promised to restrain their young men. Around noon, the Articles of Capitulation were signed. Almost immediately, following the signing of the capitulation, Native American warriors and some Canadian militia surrounded the fort, eager to claim the plunder that had been implicitly or explicitly promised for their participation in the campaign. The native warriors were not slow in falling to work. They infiltrated the fort through the gun embrasures and began to loot. They swarmed throughout the fortification, taking whatever spoils they could find. As the garrison troops from the fort began to move into the entrenched camp to join the provincials, the Native Americans shifted their attention there. They were reportedly dissatisfied that the British had been allowed to retain their personal baggage under the terms of surrender. The British forces were to remain within the confines of the entrenched camp until the following morning. Despite the presence of French guards, the native warriors could not be prevented from entering the camp and plundering it. All day, they were described as being very troublesome, stealing officers' baggage and anything else they could lay their hands on. Accounts from the time suggest that everything was done to stop them, and that we should be very lucky if we could prevent a massacre. By nightfall, a semblance of order was finally restored within the camp. To prevent further trouble, an initial decision was made that the British column should march for Fort Edward that very night. However, this order was quickly countermanded when it was discovered that many Native Americans were absent from their own camps. It was surmised that the natives, not being satisfied with the plunder they had acquired that morning, intended to attack us on our march. It was deemed more prudent for the British to remain in the entrenched camp until daylight. The soldiers within the camp spent an uneasy night under the protection of approximately 100 French regulars. The next morning, the 10th of August, the British and colonial troops anxiously prepared for their departure. They found the Native Americans, if possible, more outrageous than they had been the previous evening. Every man was armed with a tomahawk, hatchet, or some other instrument of death. The warriors surrounded the entrenched camp, climbing over the breastworks and moving throughout the camp in a menacing display. They demanded that the British surrender their valuables. These demands were made in a tone that foretold the spear would be the price of our refusal. The British soldiers earnestly entreated the French guards for assistance. However, according to some accounts, the French soldiers, whom we imagined were set to guard us, gave us no manner of assistance and advised us to give up our effects rather than dispute with the natives. The British soldiers began to discard their baggage, hoping to appease their rage, but this had no effect. The native warriors proceeded to strip the British, taking hats, swords, and clothing, leaving many quite naked. Chaos engulfed the camp. The attackers then turned their attention to the hospital tents. The Indian doctors began with their tomahawks to cure the sick and wounded. The horrid acts of cruelty perpetrated upon these unhappy wretches in full view of the remaining British troops did greatly terrify us. As these scenes of plunder and killing unfolded within the camp, the British regulars finally began their march out. They had scarcely exited the entrenchments when native warriors fell upon the rear, killing and scalping. Woe to those who brought up the rear, or those who happened to straggle. They were looked upon as dead men, and their lifeless bodies were soon seen scattered upon the ground. The sounds of the attack on the rear of the column created confusion at the head, causing the march to halt. When those at the front realized what was happening, they began to hurry forward again, which only increased the disorder. The attackers laid on smartly with their small hatchets upon those within reach. The terrified British and colonial troops broke ranks and fled the confines of the camp. It became a scene of miserable confusion, with individuals running in all directions, some towards the woods, others towards the French tents, and some back towards the fort, seeking any possible refuge. The native warriors pursued them, snatching children from their mothers' breasts and mothers from their husbands. They then singled out the men, drove them into the woods, and killed a vast many whom we saw lying on the roadside. This scene of dreadful carnage and bloodshed compelled British officers to implore the protection of the French officers on guard. However, according to some accounts, they refused and stated the British must go into the woods and shift for themselves. It should be noted, however, that other accounts suggest French officers, including the Chevalier de Lévis, ran everywhere where the situation seemed most violent, and that other French and Canadian officers followed his example in attempting to intervene. One French officer questioned the efficacy of 400 French troops attempting to restrain about 1,500 furious Indians from whom it was difficult to distinguish friend from foe in the melee. A British sergeant who bravely opposed their violence was reportedly speared through the head. The main assault on the column lasted only a few minutes. The chaos surrounding the march from the entrenched camp resulted in much confusion. Men, women, and children were taken prisoner. Some were stripped of their clothing and possessions, while others managed to flee to safety. The Native American pursuit continued for approximately half the distance to Fort Edward. Most of the British officers and many of the soldiers chose to remain with the French for protection. The number of those killed during the actual siege of Fort William Henry did not exceed 80, with 10 of those fatalities occurring within the fort itself. The number killed during the march to Fort Edward is uncertain. Nearly 30 bodies were actually seen, and from the stench that was frequent, there was reason to imagine many more lay scattered. By the night of the 10th of August, only a few hundred survivors had reached the safety of Fort Edward. Many more straggled in over the next several days. The accounts of the massacre provided by this first party of survivors caused the number of casualties to be greatly exaggerated. Initial reports placed the death toll as high as 1,500. Modern scholarly estimates, based on careful examination of available records, place the number of those killed during and immediately after the capitulation nearer to 270. The French burned Fort William Henry to the ground on the 14th of August. On the 15th of August, they returned those British prisoners whom they had managed to keep safe from the native warriors. Many other captives were later ransomed from the Native Americans in Montreal. The events at Fort William Henry were widely publicized and utilized by the British as propaganda. The narrative of the massacre served to recruit colonial soldiers for the ongoing war and to demonize both the French and their Native American allies. In the years following the siege, the story gained further currency through newspaper accounts and fictional works, most notably James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans. Many of these popular retellings distorted the actual events. Surviving diaries of men who were present paint a fascinating picture of the events, but also contain many inconsistencies and omissions. By comparing written accounts from both French and British perspectives, it is possible to piece together much of the story. Sadly, the perspective that is missing is that of the Native Americans themselves. The fall of Fort William Henry and the subsequent events marked a dark chapter in a brutal conflict. The strategic loss for the British was significant, but the bitter memory of the violence profoundly shaped perceptions and fueled the animosity that characterized the remainder of the war. The complexities of Fort William Henry's fall and its aftermath continue to be examined. Share your interpretations of these events in the comments below. If this account held your interest, please like this video and subscribe for more historical narratives.